Greetings. My name is Tariq Sirawa, and welcome to the seventh episode of my podcast, Ninth Wave. Today, I would like to discuss events of the last few days that have to do with Russia, in essence, sending a number of warnings to the West, and these warnings involved nuclear weapons. I will go into details in a second. Let me just say, I think it is probably obvious to all of us why it's important to discuss these matters and why they themselves are important, if also very disturbing. After all, even warnings that have to do with, as it were, small nuclear weapons involve, in principle, the possibility of an escalation into a larger nuclear war. And moreover, let's not forget that even the use of small nuclear weapons would be a catastrophe in and of itself. Now, let me very, very quickly summarize without much detail because it's been all over the media anyhow, and I'm sure you hardly need that from me. What has happened over the last few days? There have been several signals from the West, some of them very official, some of them sort of semi official, that seemed to show a willingness to deepen Western involvement in the war in Ukraine very substantially again. The background to this signaling is clear. The West and Ukraine are on the back foot. They have lost the initiative in this war. In fact, the situation for the West and in particular for Ukraine is one of, I think, great distress. Russia now has the initiative in the war in Ukraine. This is not entirely new, obviously not. It has also been predicted by realistic and smart observers. But the situation is, as it were, coming to a head or at least escalating in ways that clearly have some people in the West, in NATO, in Washington, in London, in Paris, very, very worried. Russia might indeed be on the verge of winning the war. It is possible that Russia could win the war even this year. That is not certain. That is not a prediction. But I do think it is certain that Western elites now are also concerned about this very real possibility. And against this backdrop, we have seen a number of attempts by the West to tell Russia that, in essence, I'm summarizing, if you dare push your advantage and if you dare coming close to actually winning the war, then we, the West, will deepen, increase our involvement again. On the side of Great Britain, through the Foreign Secretary, the Foreign Minister David Cameron, there was a very demonstrative statement in an interview that essentially said, well, if the Ukrainians want to use the missiles that we have given them, the so-called Storm Shadows, to strike deep inside Russia, then let's go. We are not against it anymore. You have to add to such an announcement from a high member of the British cabinet that, of course, it is well known that unofficially, but nevertheless, there are very, very likely to be British operators on the ground helping to launch these missiles anyhow. One reason why we know this is that, of course, a number of highly indiscreet high German officers have talked about this on a chat platform that was then overheard, that was basically wiretapped, as they would have said in the old way, in the old days, and we learned about this particular fact as a certainty. So this was quite an announcement. Then there was Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, who has for months already, on and off, threatened to bring French, that is Western, that is NATO ground troops openly into the conflict. Once again, let's not forget, French troops, like Polish troops, like British troops, like American troops, are already on the ground in Ukraine, but there is a very important difference. Up until now, their numbers are small, and the West has, so to speak, kept up appearances by not openly admitting to these things, or at the most admitting to sending advisors. Otherwise, talk has been about mercenaries and so on and so on. Now, Macron clearly upped the ante, increased the stakes by repeatedly threatening that he might also put major official French contingents on the ground in Ukraine. Didn't do that for the first time. In recent days, we had an article coming out. We don't know about the sources of this article. Let's be careful. But it was nevertheless interesting. It claimed that 100 French soldiers, as it were, from the Foreign Legion are already in Slavyansk. That is a city or a town rather close to the front line, so very close to combat actually, and that there are plans in France to send up to 1,500 more soldiers from the Foreign Legion. Once again, the article is, I wouldn't say dubious, but it is not clear how authentic it is. It is not exactly clear what the sources are. But in the current context, one thing is clear. I think the Russians took this article as well very serious, right? We've had other statements going in a similar direction. We've had them from the United States. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries comes to mind, for instance, and there are more examples. But these things from the UK and France, David Cameron and Emmanuel Macron clearly played an especially large and, as it were, triggering role for Moscow. I think there is a very specific reason why that is the case, and I will try to come back to that later. This is the bare outline of what happened on the Western side. On the Russian side, the reaction seems to have been swift. One reaction was to announce publicly that the southern military district of Russia, of the Russian Federation, is going to hold drills with so-called battlefield or tactical nuclear weapons. Those are smaller nuclear weapons, not the type that the major powers would use in an all-out nuclear war to destroy each other's cities and populations, but the type that has been designed to be used within the context of military operations to destroy, say, an important airfield, important command structures, or a major agglomeration of troops. Now, please don't get me wrong. I have been listening to an atrocious podcast from the New York Times only recently, where these weapons were belittled as if they were firecrackers. They are not firecrackers. Some of them have explosive power that is significantly lower than that of the weapons that the United States dropped in 1945 on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And some of them have actually similar explosive power. They are not at all harmless, and their use would be a major escalation in any conceivable scenario. So this has to be taken very seriously. Russia announced, we are telling the southern military district, hold drills with the deployment, with the possible use de facto of such weapons. Also often overlooked, Belarus actually announced something very similar shortly afterwards. Belarus doesn't have nuclear weapons of its own, but it has, we think in the West, a few dozen, again, small tactical battlefield nuclear weapons that Russia brought into Belarus already in the context of this war as an earlier warning gesture to the West as well. Belarus, in this context now, has also announced that its troops or its relevant troops are supposed to practice the possible use of these weapons. So it wasn't actually only Russia. In addition, the British and French ambassadors were given what can only be described as talking tos in Moscow. We don't know exactly what was said there, but it is clear that they were treated to extremely severe warnings. We will go back into the details again a little later. Now, what was the upshot of all of that as it has unfolded over the last few days? And here things get a little bit complicated, let's say. There is an optimistic reading of this whole affair, as it were. That might sound strange because, it's obviously a very grim thing when nuclear weapons are coming into play in this way. But there is an optimistic reading, and it is not implausible. And I will summarize it first, but then I will explain why I think it captures only part of the relevant reality, and why, in the end, I think we have reason to be, as I would argue, more realistic and, as others might say, more pessimistic. Now, here's the optimistic reading. The optimistic reading is that certain important players in the West launched, as it were, a sally of threats and provocations of increased intervention in the war in Ukraine against Russia. We don't know if this sally was absolutely serious, if they meant everything they said, or if there was an element of bluff. But we don't need to know, because we do know that the Russians took it very, very seriously. We know that empirically from the Russian reaction. The Russians then answered with a number of measures, including those nuclear drills, but also including these very severe warnings that they issued to the ambassadors of Great Britain and France, and I'm sure they issued some more behind the scenes to other concerned parties as well. And third, as a result, both France and Britain stepped back, shied back, retreated, whatever term you would like to use. In addition, some other important Western players felt called upon to publicly signal their distance from France and from Britain. Italy is the outstanding case. The Italians, with the Italian Minister of Defense in the lead, the Italians essentially made it very clear that, please, Moscow, we don't think like France. We are not like them. We do not want this. And we want you to know that we do not want this. So there was a little bit of an element of cracks inside NATO opening up as well. Now, why do I call this an optimistic reading of this situation? Because for all of us, whether you're in the West, in the East, or wherever you are on this planet, it is obviously a good thing that loose provocations aiming at an even greater escalation of this war have ended up perhaps in a dead end, even if only for now. And it is obviously also a good thing that the Russian warning, with the help of their tactical nuclear missiles, has at least apparently or seemingly been taken seriously enough so that these Western players did in the end shy away. That you can interpret as not the worst possible outcome of this kind of situation. That's the optimism, right? And now I would like to explain why I think that there's truth to that interpretation, at least for now. Things can change, at least for now. But on the other hand, there are very substantial reasons why we should not be too optimistic, why we should be very vigilant, and why, in fact, we should remain very concerned. Let me start with a larger background here. What we have actually seen in this crisis, right, was an application of Russian nuclear doctrine as it has developed since the year 2000. 2000 is a reasonable milestone origin year here. I won't go into all the details, but let me put it like this. About 10 years after the Cold War ended, a little more, right? And about 10 years after the Soviet Union ended, something very important happened in the Russian leadership. It did not happen now, and it did not happen in the context of the Ukrainian conflict only. It happened back then in 2000. Namely, the Russians looked at the world. It had to do with the then beginning Second Chechen War. It had to do with Western intervention in the Balkans, in Kosovo. The Russians looked at the world and told themselves, we have a problem. We have a large nuclear arsenal. but the conventional forces of the West, if they really, really get them together, are extremely dangerous to us, and they're potentially larger than ours. And the second part of the problem, the West is both unpredictable and aggressive. And even by 2000, the Russians had excellent reasons to see the West in this manner. This wasn't paranoia, this was actually a fairly reasonable assessment of who they were dealing with. And the response, even in the year 2000, to this particular problem was, and I'm now summarizing, but I'm summarizing, I hope, in a fair way, to lower the threshold for the possible use of Russia's nuclear weapons. It's really, in the end, at its core, not that complicated. The Russians looked at the world. They felt that they were looking at a severe imbalance where the West could hurt them massively with conventional weapons. They felt that the West was not somebody, some people they could rely on. And they came to the conclusion to say, look, we have to tell this West that if you ever really, really mess with us, we might use our nuclear weapons faster than you think. And we may use them under circumstances that are not as extreme as you think, right? So they lowered the general threshold for the possible use of nuclear weapons. This is something that, I repeat, began in the year 2000 and has been consistently developed in Russian nuclear weapons policy, in Russian nuclear doctrine since then. And it has very important aspects. Now, let me get one thing out of the way. A lot of people go back not that far, but only to the year 2020. To be precise, to the summer of that year, I think it was July, when a very important decree came out, signed by the Russian President Vladimir Putin, that one again in a number of points, you can look it up on the internet, it's all there, it's all published, explained under what circumstances, in principle, Russia would be ready to use nuclear weapons. And one of these points contains a phrase that has often been badly misunderstood, and that misunderstanding is dangerous. Because the phrase, I think it's point 17 or so, goes something like this. I'm paraphrasing, but it's very close. We, the Russian Federation, could use nuclear weapons when we think that because of a military attack, the very existence of our state is in danger. Now, some very superficial people who don't read enough and don't go back enough in time keep misinterpreting that phrase as very reassuring, because the way they read it is, oh, there you have it. The Russians have told us that the only reason they ever would use a nuclear weapon is if basically, foreign troops at the gates of Moscow, and at the same time, they are facing a massive loss of their own population. And also, somebody has declared total war on them and said, we're going to abolish you. This is not the case. The Russians have not restricted the use of nuclear weapons to such an apocalyptic scenario. I understand that that famous phrase in that one sentence can be misunderstood that way. But here's the thing. To understand Russian nuclear doctrine, you have to read much more than one sentence because there is much more. So let's get a little bit broader here. First of all, when you go through the relevant documents, you will find that very often other criteria are also mentioned, not just an imminent threat to the very existence of the state. And these other criteria very often contain the phrases the integrity of the Russian Federation. Integrity is a different thing. Now, I'm coming back to the fact here that the nuclear exercise, the nuclear drill that was ordered by the president, Vladimir Putin, was ordered specifically in the southern Russian military district. And what you need to understand about this district is, many of you will know this, is that in Russian logic, the way they see it, it covers parts of Russia in the southwest of Russia, as you would have guessed. but it also covers parts of Ukraine that the Russians now claim for themselves. Now, again, don't get me wrong, please. I'm not offering you any opinion here on whether these territories are really Ukrainian or maybe the Russians have sort of got a claim to them. My opinion is that under international law, they are actually Ukrainian. My opinion is also that it doesn't make sense to fight over this. So that's a bit complicated. But let's set that aside. What is important here is how the Russians see this, because they're the ones with the nuclear weapons, and we are thinking about the way that they might actually use them, right? They think that Crimea is part of Russia. They think that the eastern Ukrainian territories that, at one point existed as sort of rebel or separatist republics, the former Donetsk People's Republic and the former Luhansk or Lugansk People's Republic, are now part of Russia. And they also claim that the Ukrainian regions or oblasts of Kherson and Zaporizhia, or Zaporizhia in Russian, are now part of Russia. Once again, under international law, you can very well disagree with that Russian opinion, but the point is that's how they see it, and they are the ones with the nuclear weapons. So we better think about how they see it. Now, if someone were to interpret the phrase integrity, which turns up again and again in documents on Russian nuclear doctrine, very literally as territorial integrity, then even a threat to these territories could actually be interpreted by Moscow as crossing the threshold after which it might reach for a nuclear weapon. Don't get me wrong, I don't actually think this is the Russian position. I think the Russian position in reality is much less rigid and much more flexible. Thank God for that, by the way. But I'm trying to outline to you that in Russian military doctrine, as we actually find it, these options are also there. And at its extreme end of, as it were, looseness of use of nuclear weapons, these options are very far away from we are only going to reach for our nukes in case we are about to be exterminated. This is not the case. The doctrine leaves much more room for much earlier uses of nuclear weapons. This is a key point people need to understand. Secondly, what I also find astonishing, frankly, is that in a lot of these discussions, these Russian warnings about tactical or battlefield or small nuclear weapons are understood as if they automatically implied that even if Russia were to use such a weapon, it would only, in quotation marks please, use it on the territory of Ukraine, right? In fact, Russian military doctrine says the exact opposite. And this again goes back to the early 2000s. In 2003, the Russian Military of Defense issued an official document, a white paper, we would say, in which it explained that this right that the Russian Federation reserved to itself of using its nuclear weapons under certain circumstances did not exclude using them outside the context of a given local conflict. Okay, this sounds very abstract, but it's going to get much more specific soon. One reason is Vladimir Putin has recently made this very specific for us. Also often overlooked, in February 2024, this year, Putin has given a speech to the federal chamber, essentially, a federal assembly in Russia. Very important speech, very important occasion. And in this speech, at one point, he essentially addressed not that assembly, but the West. And what he says very, very clearly in this speech, you can look it up, again, I'm paraphrasing, is if you continue messing with us in Ukraine, please understand we have weapons that can reach you in your own countries. Right? This is the opposite, the exact opposite of saying, if you keep messing with us in Ukraine, we will always strike back only within this Ukrainian conflict theater. He said the opposite in February, as recently as that. He once again warned this is not the first time, and it is in perfect sync with Russian military doctrine that we also reserve the right to strike, as it were, at the root of our problem. And the root of that problem could be, for instance, in London, in Paris, or maybe in Washington. Right? Now, people have pointed out, and this is right, and therefore I should mention it as well, that that does not necessarily mean a nuclear strike. Russia by now has also developed much better conventional capacities than it had in the early 2000s. And some observers have made the argument that in a way, in a very, very paradoxical way, this has made the world a tiny little bit safer because it offers the Russian leadership, if it really came to the extreme conclusion to say, well, we will have to strike on NATO territory, right? The option of at least not using a nuclear weapon immediately, right? That's what we now consider safer, right? In the world we actually live in. It's terrible, but that's a possibility as well. But on the other hand, do not forget that this warning to potentially also strike beyond the area of a localized conflict, to strike at, so to speak, the home country of Russia's opponents, that this warning certainly does not exclude nuclear weapons either. So that's important, right? Now, there are certain other aspects that also matter in this context. One is we seem to know that during the war between Russia and Georgia in 2008, there were discussions among Russian planners to what countries the nuclear doctrines of Russia really applied. Again, a little abstract, I make it more concrete. The question was, do we really mean this about every potential adversary? Or do we mean it about potential adversaries who also own nuclear weapons as we do? And the outcome of these discussions seems to have been that no, actually, this is more meant, at least more, for those who also own nuclear weapons, not so much for the others, right? But now again, I'm sorry this gets so nitty gritty, but it's very important here. The details really matter. This did not mean, and does not mean, under Russian nuclear doctrine, that again Russia would only use nuclear weapons if those nuclear armed adversaries would reach for their own nuclear weapons. It's exactly what it doesn't mean. It still means Russia reserves the right to respond with nuclear weapons to aggression from these adversaries, even if that aggression is carried out by conventional means. The decisive criteria is, do they also have nuclear weapons or not? And what is interesting here is that the peak Russian warning, right? The peak sternness that Russia delivered over the last few days was precisely targeting Britain and France. And what do they have in common? They don't only have in common that they have recently massively provoked Russia, which is true. They have something else in common. They are nuclear armed states. They are nuclear armed states. They have small arsenals compared to with what Russia has, or say the United States. These are very small arsenals, but they're bad enough. But the point is, they do have nuclear weapons. So this was actually, this whole a very severe warning operation, again, was in almost, you know, in in striking compliance with Russia's own nuclear doctrine. It was applied, as it were, to the dot over the last few days, not yet in a strike, but in a warning of a potential strike. Right? This is a very important point. It may sound a little technical, but it's not, and I will explain in a second why I think it's so important. But before we do that, what is the core of this doctrine that we're looking at? Western observers have sometimes used, as I think, a very useful phrase here, and which is to escalate to de-escalate. Escalate to de-escalate. Now, please Don't be angry with me that sounds paradoxical, that sounds very cold, that sounds very disturbing in the context of nuclear weapons. I bet it does. I'm sure it does. But unfortunately, everything about nuclear weapons doctrine everywhere in the world is extremely disturbing. So we still need to take it seriously. The phrase to escalate, to de escalate, as a description of the core of this Russian nuclear doctrine, essentially means that Russia made up its mind from the early 2000s to say, we are not going to rule out the use of nuclear weapons in relatively low level conflicts because we will not wait until we are almost dead before we use them. Instead, we will look at a conflict, even in relatively early stages, and if we think this could end up very big and very bad for us, we will escalate first to force our adversary to de escalate, to step back. That's the theory. And it's important because this de escalation, this early de escalation move, is supposed to happen by nuclear weapons. Now, in addition, we have had also in February of this year, I think, reports of leaked Russian exercise documents. These weren't real wars, but exercises, which took place, I think, 2008 to 2014. Details are not important here. What is important, that what they had in common was that in these exercises, nuclear weapons were, in a simulated manner, used early, very early. The Russian government commented on these leaked documents by saying, well, that's not authentic. We don't confirm this. It's not us. And that was it. But at the same time, I do think, and this is also the reaction of many experts, that there are very good reasons to take this serious and to consider very, very possible that these leaks were done deliberately. Also, to once again impress on the West, when we say we could reach for nuclear weapons faster than you think, we mean it. Right? Now, there's one last point that I would like to raise here, which is that the West has a history of not believing Russia in a very specific way. In 2021, and I mean at the end of 2021, when there was a conflict in Ukraine, but it was very small scale by comparison with what we have now. At the end of 2021, Russia essentially, again, I won't go into the details, sent the West an extremely loud signal. It essentially hollered at the West in diplomatic terms. And it said, we have had it. We are out of road. We are no longer retreating. If you go on expanding NATO, if you try to make Ukraine a NATO member, if you try to make Ukraine a NATO member on the sly, as you are doing already, we will no longer accept it. We will now resist you. Except you come to the table and we talk about a grand bargain. They didn't use this term, but this is what that was about. It was a last minute diplomatic, very loud warning saying, here are two treaties for the West, for America, for NATO. We need to talk about this. The West blew the Russians off. This is what really happened. It blew them off. The rest was rhetoric. Of course, you got people like Jens Stoltenberg and similar sort of figureheads spouting this nonsense like, oh, we are ready to talk, except about anything the Russians really want to talk about, right? That's all nonsense. What the West essentially did when this last minute warning before this large scale war that we now have came in from Russia, that was very fair of them, frankly. The West said, nah, we don't care. We just go on as before. Now, why am I reminding you of this now? Because what Russia has just done with this drill and with its warnings is actually not a one-off. It is, as I've tried to explain, the outcome of almost a quarter century now of the development of its nuclear doctrine. And it's consistent with that development. And they have published enough about their own nuclear doctrine to assume that if we only want to, we can know what they are telling us. right? So this is another instance where Russia is, I think, sending us an extremely important, if very rough, signal. And I hope that media persons, politicians, planners, so called military experts, many of whom have certainly not had a glorious record in this war and over the time of this war, finally absorb this one big lesson, which is the Russians actually sometimes mean it. And especially when they're telling you, this concerns our vital interests, and we really don't want to go on like this with you, we've had enough, they mean it. And when that happens, do not just blow them off. You need to think very carefully about what they've just told you. That is my conclusion from this episode. And I think it is an episode. I think this problem has not ended, right? In the optimistic scenario, it has ended sort of, at least for now, well as can be nowadays. There's some truth to that. It could have been worse. But similar issues can come back. The Russians have certainly not removed the whole nuclear doctrine from the table. In fact, if the optimists are right and the Russians have succeeded in deterring this Western sally, then the Russians have just learned that their nuclear doctrine can actually work. But the point is, it needs to work enough. It needs to work enough. And I'm not saying this because I have a stake in Russia succeeding. I'm saying this because we all have a stake in not having a nuclear war. And before I conclude, one more consideration that I think far too many people are overlooking. If it ever came to the use of a Russian nuclear weapon in the context of this Ukraine conflict, either in Ukraine or outside Ukraine, there are two possibilities. One is what everybody seems to be thinking about, that from the use of such a battlefield or tactical nuclear weapon, things could escalate into the big Mad Max Thunderdome scenario, right? The type of nuclear war that goes through several stages until hundreds or thousands of nuclear weapons are being used, and until we are either gone really as a species, or certainly as a civilization, or as an organized species, like the world ending type of nuclear war, which is not impossible. This is what many people are concerned about, and they're very right to be concerned about. But now consider an alternative scenario. Consider a scenario in which Russia uses one nuclear weapon, the West answers with one nuclear weapon, and they stop. And they stop. In this scenario, as gruesome as it is, and it is not unrealistic, we would all sigh with relief, except the poor people who got in the way of those two nuclear strikes, obviously. We would have had two nuclear strikes, maybe not too big, but they're all awful. We would have fallout, we would have tens of thousands of dead, and so on and so on. But in the end, we would sigh with relief because we would say at least it didn't end up with Armageddon. We as a species are still here. But please don't stop thinking here. Because in that scenario as well, something very, very bad would have happened, apart from the nuclear strikes. Those are bad enough. And that second bad thing is, we would then be in a world in which small scale nuclear war would have occurred and become normalized, in which a small scale use of nuclear weapons would have been treated as, well, one other thing one can do in war. There is, if you want, even a bit of a connection to what is happening now in Gaza. Gaza is about normalizing genocide, among many other things. But this is one thing that Gaza is about. Israel and the West are conducting a genocide. That is not just a war, that is a genocide. And they're not letting go of their victims. And we are all being trained, if we accept this, I don't obviously, I hope you don't, but we are all being trained into thinking, into believing that, oh, this is also part of war. Yeah, it's a bit rough at the edges, even for war, but that also comes under war. No, it doesn't. That's genocide, right? They're normalizing genocide in Gaza. If we end up in a world where a limited nuclear war has happened, say 2 nukes, one each side. We are in a world where limited nuclear war has been normalized. Welcome to the future. So, unfortunately, I have to end on, as I warned you at the beginning, Russian style, a realistic note. Many will say a pessimistic note, but I really think that is appropriate to the circumstances we are in. That's the way it is, and we should actually just face that reality. That's one of the things we can still do, I feel. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you much. Thank you very much for your time also, if you have listened to this whole episode up until now, especially. I see you again very soon.